Okay, all right. I guess that means we are ready. So, welcome and thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Lynn Knight, and I'm the president of the Board of Trustees. I'm sorry we're not meeting in person, but given the current pandemic situation and the variants, we felt it wasn't time to have an in-person meeting. As it was for everyone, it was another strange year for HHLT, but fortunately, notwithstanding the strangeness, we had a good year. Our preserves continued to provide sought-after respite for many. Our membership remained strong. Our volunteers stuck with us with the same amount of enthusiasm. And we added a new preserve, which Reed will talk about in a few minutes. Also, we finally got back to some in-person outdoor programming this spring, which was very welcome. But as always, we can do what we do only because of your support. The support of our members, the tremendous work of our creative, amazing staff, the support of our roll up the sleeves, hardworking trustees, and the work of many other volunteers who donate lots of their time. Thank you to all of you for enabling us to sustain Wild Places in Harpswell. It truly is a community effort. As an overview for tonight's meeting, we will have a brief business meeting to update you on our activities over the past year. I will point out a couple of administrative accomplishments. Reed will talk about conservation and stewardship activities, and Julia will highlight our outreach activities. Then, as we do every year, we will present our nominations for your vote. It will then be our pleasure to present our speaker for tonight, Kate Dempsey, State Director of the Nature Conservancy in Maine. But first, I'd like to share a pictorial tour of some of our past year's activities. Okay. Many of the photos in the slideshow came from our This Week in Harpswell photo project, and you can see more of those fantastic photos that captured specific weeks in each season on our website. I encourage you to go look at them. Some of the photos are really amazing. So in terms of administrative activities, I'd like to highlight two major accomplishments from this past year. The first is that our national accreditation status was renewed. Perhaps not such a glittery thing, but it should let you rest easy knowing that your donations are being well spent and your conservation lands are being well cared for. Accreditation is given for a 5-year period by the Land Trust Accreditation Commission, part of a National Association for Land Trusts. Obtaining accreditation status is not insignificant. The application process is extensive, and the Commission carefully analyzes lots of information about our governance, financial activities, and land transactions and more. Our status was renewed for the next 5 years, and for that, we're very proud. Being an accredited land trust assures you, our members, that we're an ethical and well-run organization. The second accomplishment was that we prepared our 5-year strategic plan. Because of the pandemic, the accreditation process was delayed, and that put both of these big undertakings on the same timeline. But as everybody, none of us were going anywhere, so it wasn't really a problem. So we went to work over many Zoom sessions, and it was a great exercise, not only to renew the blueprint for our work, but also to stop and reflect on what we've accomplished over the past 5 years. And it was a lot. To point out just the conservation accomplishments, we added 3 new preserves and 3 easements, conserving 217 more acres. And the list of stewardship and outreach activities over those 5 years is extraordinary and just underscores the level of support and commitment that HHLT has for its work. So one last thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Reed is a personal project of mine. In 2018, I started a community nature journaling effort inspired by this book. The premise of the book by Professors Bern Heinrich and Nat Wheelwright is to track the seasonal changes you observe over a multi-year period. So nature journaling in this way allows you to make interesting comparisons from one year to the next. Keeping my own journal and sharing observations with the Harpswell Nature Watchers online community has been very rewarding. My passion is native plants, so my posts are generally about seasonal changes in our plant communities, but other HHLT folks or members of the Harpswell Nature Watchers group post a variety of observations, and I want to share a sampling of them because some of the photos posted are truly amazing and I think you'll enjoy it. This monarch butterfly, captured by Howard Marshall, is enjoying the milkweed flowers. Here's a stunning black-crowned night heron, photographed by Gina Snyder. And this whale was sighted off Stover's Point on June 27th by Shannon McGee Grower. Also photographed by Shannon is this fabulous series of pictures of a cormorant fishing. And this dramatic series of photos was taken by Howard Marshall of an osprey diving for dinner. You got it. So I want to recommend the practice of keeping a nature journal. And if you're interested, I encourage you to join the Harpswell Nature Watchers Facebook group. If you're not a Facebook user, you can participate by signing up to receive a collection of postings every month via an e-newsletter. Just go to our website to see how to participate. That way you will know early April's the time that blue herons return. The first week of May is time to look for trailing arbutus, one of the earliest native wildflowers to bloom. The last week of May, it's time to head to the woods to catch the lady slippers flowering. And very important, when are the low bush blueberries ripe and ready to pick right now. So now I'd like to turn it over to Reed Coles, our Executive Director.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. First off, I would like to introduce the newest member of our staff, Amelia Graham, our Development Associate. Amelia came to us in March from the Connecticut Forest and Parks Association, a statewide land trust where she was the development assistant. She has right into our efforts to ensure the trust's long-term financial stability, to strengthen our membership support, and to raise funds for new conservation acquisitions. We are very happy to have her aboard. The past year has seen our usual busy level of conservation and stewardship activity. We now have 17 preserves, and we are always extremely busy trying to maintain the trails and keep them open to the public and keep them in good condition. Since our last annual meeting, we have acquired 2 new conservation easements covering 65 acres on Harpswell Neck and preserving over half a mile of undeveloped shorefront. Thanks to the generosity and support of you, our members, we were also able to raise the money and acquire 2 parcels at the mouth of Strawberry Creek to help preserve the iconic view of 2 small islands and Harpswell Sound, as well as protect over 60 acres of valuable mudflats, rockweed beds, and eelgrass beds at the mouth of the creek, all of which contributes significantly to the quality of wildlife habitat in Harpswell and the marine and our quality of life. We are now actively pursuing 2 additional conservation projects, and I hope to have news for you by the end of the year. Our trustee and volunteer community stewards did their usual excellent job of keeping our trails open and safe. Under the leadership of Stewardship Coordinator Priscilla Simer, the critical annual monitoring of our easements went smoothly with no significant problems observed. The Harpswell Invasive Plant Partnership continued to work on the Herculean job of controlling invasive plants on our preserves. We depend heavily on volunteers to accomplish all of our work building and maintaining our trails and preserves. I thank all of our trustee and community stewards and many other stewardship volunteers for their dedication and energy. What you do is enormously appreciated. I also want to thank all of you who so generously supported the trust in the last difficult years. The graphs you see on your screen show the increase in numbers of members and the increase in their support over recent years. Thanks to you, we remain in a strong financial position as we look to the future. Before I pass the torch, I would like to express my deeply felt gratitude for the excellent leadership provided by Lynn Knight as our president for the last 4 years. She exemplifies the dedication and commitment of time and energy from our trustees that enable us to accomplish so much. Thank you for listening and for your support. Now I'd like to introduce our outreach director, Julia McLeod.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia, and I get the pleasure of talking to you about our outreach efforts over the past year. It's been a year of happily returning to normal activities. One of those returning to normals that didn't go away for long is our outdoor programming with Harpswell Community School. In the fall and spring, I went over there and taught outdoor Harpswell-focused science lessons in the woods near the school. By the end of the school year, that added up to 65 lessons and reached all students in that school, which is our local elementary school. It was so wonderful to be working with young people and to help them develop a connection to Harpswell, a love of science, and a love of learning outdoors. And topics for those programs ranged from animal traits to erosion to Maine habitats. And teachers were really grateful for support in a challenging year. Another thing that we are doing again this summer is our popular Nature Day Camp, which has been happening for many years. Took a break from it last year, but we're back at it this year. When we opened registration in March, the demand crashed our website. So we took that in stride, we expanded our offerings, and we reopened on a lottery basis. And so this summer we have around 160 campers in 12 sessions throughout the summer for preschool and elementary age kids. And you can see from the photos, and I have so many more photos that I didn't include in here, that the kids are having fun, getting muddy, exploring, playing, connecting with each other, and building positive memories of our time together in Harpswell. I want to take a moment to thank the Holbrook Community Foundation for their support for our education work, both our work with local schools and Nature Day Camp. The Forest Playground is set up again this summer for play and discovery. This is an initiative we created, a pop-up play area we created in 2019, but didn't set up in 2020. This summer you can find it at Schofield Shores Preserve, and I encourage you to go see it. Unfortunately, the forest playground has experienced repeated vandalism this summer, which I'm not going to spend any more time talking about here, but there's an excellent letter about this vandalism written by Christine Backer that you can find on our website. It was in a newsletter recently. But despite that vandalism, the playground is there and open for play, and you can see some of our campers finding joy and discovery in nature-based play. So last summer, when we made the difficult decision to cancel Nature Day Camp, we decided to create exploration kits to give tools and inspiration for exploration at home or at our preserves or on your own time. So they were hugely popular, and we distributed about 200 of them in 2020, and we are over that number this year so far. They're offered on a sliding scale donation basis to make them accessible to many people. And there are 5 different types, well, 4 different types for the summer: exploration essentials, all about forest animals, butterfly lovers, and tide pool explorers. And then in the winter, we also had a winter adventurers one, and we still have some. So if you're looking for something to do with kids or grandkids this summer, these provide a lot of ideas and some fun activities and tools for your exploration. One of the resources in the Tide Pool Explorers kit this summer is this brand new guide to the seashore life of Harpswell. So this is a pocket naturalist guide. It folds out, it's on waterproof paper, so it's really sturdy for taking to your shoreline exploration. There's illustrations of 125 of the most common animals and seaweeds that you can find along the shoreline in Harpswell, as well as some general information. So it's a great resource. We spent a lot of time working with a number of local scientists to research this and put this together. So I encourage you to check this out. We have tons of them at our office. We're offering it free for educators, but we are charging $8 per guide for other folks. But believe me, it is worth it. It's a great resource. We've also been offering a variety of public programs, as always. This year, we chose the theme of Stories of Change. So this is a theme that's shared between our programs committee and our communications committee. So you may have noticed some articles on this theme in our email newsletter, and then we also have a monthly webinar on this theme. These webinars are recorded, and you can find the recordings on our website, and we've had some really wonderful talks so far, so I encourage you to check out those recordings. And if you're interested in joining us for the webinars that are coming up, you can see on the screen what we have coming up. We have Words and Watersheds with Gary Lawless, which is actually happening the day after tomorrow. We have Bats, Behavior, and Wind Farms in August. We have Global Climate Justice Movement in September, and we have Rockweed Focus in October, and we'll continue those throughout the year. We're also offering in-person programs. We're sort of easing our way back into our normal busy schedule of in-person programming. We've had a birding walk and a lichen walk in recent months. Rachel Bean's going to lead a geology walk in August, which you can sign up for on our website. And we were really happy to go back to our summer solstice, our annual summer solstice celebration, where we have live music and a picnic at beautiful Johnson Field Preserve at Mackerel Cove. We were especially grateful this year as Claude Bolduc and Lou Chamberlain offered to make free pizza for everyone, and that was wonderful. It was offered by a group they're part of. It's called the Bunchberry Stewards, and they were offering that pizza in appreciation of our protection of the new Strawberry Creek Preserve. So it was a great evening. And the final thing I want to talk to you about tonight is a new collaborative project that we've done in collaboration with Harpswell Aging at Home, where we provided free container gardens to local residents. Volunteers planted and delivered tomatoes, green beans, salad greens, and herbs for 29 seniors in Harpswell. The seedlings were donated by Six River Farm, and the funding came from Harpswell Heritage Land Trust Community Garden Fund, which also provides funding to Harpswell Community Garden at Mitchell Field and the gardens at Harpswell Community Nursery School and Harpswell Community School. I am so excited. I just love to imagine all the people who are enjoying the tomatoes off their plants and enjoying eating fresh greens right from their deck and yard. I've already heard from several of them about how much they're enjoying the food. So that was a new collaboration that we decided to bring community gardens to people's homes. So that's all that I have to report on tonight, and I'll pass it back over to Lynn. Oh, I'll just say thank you so much for all coming. It's really wonderful to see those of you that I can see and to have you all here with us tonight.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, now we're going to ask you for your vote. This year, we are nominating trustees that are up for re-election for another 3-year term, as well as trustees to fill our board officer positions. We're not nominating any new trustees because we believe we have the maximum number of trustees at the moment for an efficient board. So for re-election, we are nominating Becky Gallery, Lou Hinman, Tim McCrate, and Marianne Nave. And for president, we are nominating Wendy Batson, who is currently serving as vice president, Tim McCrate, who had been serving as secretary, Dan Huber, Dan Huber, who has been treasurer, and then Sharon Omeg for secretary, and Sharon is a longtime trustee. So is there a motion to vote on the slate of trustees and officers as presented?
So moved.
Seconded? Okay, we have
Second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor, please raise your hand so we could see it on the Zoom screen, and just hold it up for a bit so we can kind of scroll through. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Any opposed? Okay, I think we are all set. Thank you for your vote. And I want to say thank you to you, Reed, for your kind words before about my presidency. It's been great working with you and Julia and the other staff members. And it's been an honor to work with such a competent board of trustees. And now it's time to announce winners of our raffle. As you probably know, we held a raffle to try to replace some of the income that we would normally have raised with our Sunset Cruise, which we were not able to host. Our purchase of the gift certificates also served to support our local businesses. So I'd like to thank all those who participated. We raised more than $4,800, which is wonderful. And so here are our winners: Ed Anania, Leslie Inman, Susan Horowitz, Margaret Rousseau, Shelley Broder, Bettina Lucier, and Mary Greenlee. And whether or not they are present tonight, winners will be contacted about picking up their gift certificates or having them mailed. And lastly, I want to take a brief moment to recognize our business sponsors. These companies have supported us with generous donations in 2020 and 2021. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Kate Dempsey. Kate has served as State Director of the Nature Conservancy in Maine since 2016. Among her areas of expertise are climate strategy, public policy, and conservation partnerships. She's a member of the Maine Climate Council, and that is the topic on which she's going to talk to us tonight. And if you have questions during the talk, please feel free to type them into the chat, and we will get to those questions after Kate finishes her talk. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. Great to be here. Wonderful to see you all. And Julia, just as anticipated, I am having a slight problem. So a year and a half on Zoom and it still happens. So let me see if I can just get the right screen up for myself. And fingers crossed. It is. You're seeing that, right?
That looks great on my end.
Okay, let me just test for some reason. Yikes. Oh, classic. Team, we did practice, I promise. Screen. Right, hold on. Sorry about this. Now, are you seeing my notes, Julia?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, okay. That's what the problem is. Let's see. Okay. 1 second, I think I got it.
Know how to show
Yep,
it with.
I got it. I think I got it, believe it or not. There.
That looks great.
All right. Whew. Nothing like Zoom to throw you off. Well, it is so awesome to be here. Thank you, Julia, Lynn, Reed, and the looks like almost 100 people who are gathered this evening. It's super wonderful to see some familiar faces, and welcome to the ones I haven't met. Thanks for inviting me. And I do want to recognize all that the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust does for Maine. And I certainly love seeing all the preserves that have been recently added. And just to highlight something that was said earlier, Land Trust movement has really recognized this last year and a half how important local conservation is. We have seen a huge uptick in use of preserves and state land. So happy to talk about that later, but let me tell you what my plan is for this evening. I'm going to start with answering a pressing question. I'm going to give you a sense, as Lynn said, of some of the work we did with the Maine Climate Council. And then I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. And I think Julia is going to facilitate that. So feel free to put questions in the chat at any time and we'll come back to them. And Julia, one other shout out to my friend and colleague, Anya Wright, who you mentioned was speaking in September. I really urge you to attend that event. Anya is a phenomenal young woman from Maine, went to College of the Atlantic, and was on the Climate Council with me. So I fully recommend hearing her speak. So I'm going to pause for a minute of reflection. I'm calling in from Bath, Maine, and wherever you are calling in from, most of us, I suspect, are calling in from Maine. And we do so from the ancestral territory of the Wabanaki people. The lands and waters of Maine have been their home for thousands of years. Yet today they maintain the opportunity to steward less than 1% of their original homeland. Here, as in many places around the world, Indigenous people have continually been denied the opportunity to participate in meaningful ways in decisions that affect their traditional lands, waters, and livelihoods. So as the director of the Nature Conservancy, I feel it's particularly important to recognize and pay respect to the Wabanaki people. Many of them are wonderful colleagues, and I acknowledge their deep and ongoing connection to the future of the lands, waters, and communities in the place we all call Maine. So I'm working under the assumption most of you know a little bit about the Nature Conservancy, so I'm actually not going to talk much about TNC. Happy to take questions in the Q&A, but I really wanted to talk about what we all can do about climate change. But just as a quick overview, today the Nature Conservancy works in over 72 countries, and together as one organization, we're working to find ways to protect the biodiversity of the planet and slow climate change. In Maine, we're focused on clean water and connected rivers, thriving and resilient forests, an ocean that supports a multitude of species and users, and we're helping to take urgent action on climate change. So, you may not know this, but I graduated from Bowdoin College, and it was quite a decent amount of time ago now, back in the mid-'80s. and super relevant to this group and your new preserve, my senior year, I lived out on Potts Point. And I have great pride in saying that I never tell this story. I was the only one of all those Bowdoin students who lived out there at the time who managed not to go off the road commuting into the college in the winter, and I'm a Philly kid, so that was a big victory. But I'm sharing this particular photo to get us thinking about our personal stories. Lynn, your example is going to just ride right through here. So let me thank you for giving me a great example. So personal stories are so important with climate change. So here's a tiny slimmer of mine. I played a ton of lacrosse while I was at Bowdoin. And I will always remember when I'd come back from Philadelphia from winter break and snow would be piled up along the windows of the Hawthorne Longfellow Library. In February, we'd start indoor lacrosse practice, and if there are any Bowdoin people in the audience, it was in the pit, that big dirty place. And then eventually we'd get outside for games. This photo, as you may know, is taken only a few years ago. And now, while weather is not climate change, and we can talk about that, I use this photo here to simply show that any of us can speak from personal experiences about climate change. And for those of you who are here in the winter, I think we'd all say that the snow just doesn't last as long on the coast. And in fact, it quickly returns to ice or rain. So just for me, in the past 30 years since I left Bowdoin, I have witnessed dramatic change. And it's not just about stories, right? The New York Times wrote today, it's warming here in Maine. We have amazing graphs that is in the Times this morning. And obviously this week, none of us can turn away from the fact that climate change is happening now. And we're seeing the impacts in Europe, in British Columbia, Oregon, and we've known there have been impacts in island communities around the world for a long time. So to begin the conversation tonight, I want to break down a myth that I've kind of hinted at. So here it is. The myth is that you need to be an expert to talk about climate change. In fact, all the expertise and data is super important, but it in fact overwhelms people. So the top question I get when I talk about climate change is, what can I do? And what we're going to just do a little kind of at-home practice. We won't do it live. I usually do this in a room with all of you together and have some fun. But I really want to begin by digging into how to have a productive conversation about climate change. Let's set the stage for a second. So I want each of you to think about yourselves. We may use the chat a little bit later, but let's just do some self-reflection. So on a scale from 1 to 10, where would you place yourself between these two answers? Humans will find a way to innovate our way out of this. I can't sleep, I'm up all night worrying. So just in your head, hold that number. And if you're I see a couple families out there, you might have differing opinions too. Okay, so next question. Again, on a scale of 1 to 10 in your head, please answer, what's the likelihood you talk about climate change? Lan, clearly you do, but let's see in your own mind, never is a 1, 10 is a bring it on. Hold that number. And now if you want to use the chat, feel free to. If not, just keep going, holding this information in your head. Okay, so would the answer to that earlier question, what's the likelihood of talking about climate change? How would it change if you knew you were about to enter a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you? And then the next bit of research is from Yale University, their climate communications program. They've been tracking over many years Americans' attitudes on climate change. So just again, either in chat or in your own head, how many 1 in 10 Americans believe what's the percentage of Americans who believe in climate change? That could be human caused or understand that the science is not debated. Does anyone want to just shout out if you know? I love participation, so it kills me to be on Zoom.
70%.
Ah, who was that? Whomever that was, you were right on. Was that Tony? Of course. Hi, Tony. Tony's right on. And here's the next question. So how many of those 10 talk about climate change? People self-report that less than 50% of us talk about climate change at any time. Now, here's the kicker. We're convinced, as I said earlier, that expertise matters. We need to show people how much things are real. In fact, the most powerful thing we can each do is talk about climate change. That's why my talk is called Let's Talk Climate Change. So we know from social science that discussing global warming leads to greater acceptance of climate science. And in fact, us in the conservation environmental community have actually done ourselves and the planet a disservice, I would argue, because what we've done is posit up until about this year that climate change is far away. You know, the image of the panda on the iceberg floating, that's super far away. Most of us haven't been to Alaska or Greenland. And so it doesn't feel like something that's happening to us. And just like other social change movements, we know that discussing climate change makes a difference to the people around you, and that in turn leads to politicians taking more action if they're convinced. Again, Anya will be a really great person to discuss this with as well, because we also know that the numbers that Tony referenced, the 70%, are, I think, just off the top of my head, I was looking at the numbers this morning, around 85, 90% for people Anya's age. They know that climate change is happening. So I want to give a few tips about how to have productive conversations about climate change. These seem obvious when you're looking at them, but just remember how few of us talk about climate change in our kind of daily interactions. Tip 1, meet people where they are. So that journal again was such a great example. So you ask each other open-ended questions like, hey, is fishing different for you because of the changes in climate? Or I know they're not super native, but my lilacs seem to be blooming sooner each year than they did when I was in my 20s. What changes have you seen in your garden? So by asking open-ended questions rooted in personal and/or shared experiences, you build a connection. And speaking of building connection, the other important thing, again, building on that last point, is that we all know that how we respond to someone is in fact almost more important than what they're saying. So one example would be like, the summer camp we both sent our kids to had to close because it was 95 degrees for a week. Or remember the beach we used to go to as kids? It's now a sliver of what it was because the ocean has gotten higher there. And this is a great one for all of us to remember. Conversations are conversations. They're not debates or conquests. Pay attention to how you're engaging in a conversation. Don't rebut too much. Say things like, I've been talking too much. I really want to hear what you think. Getting people to talk about their experiences begins to bolster their sense that this is something happening in their lives. And then this is the last tip. Again, great life lessons. Focus on the person across from you. Don't interrupt, don't call them names. This is why social media gets so heated, because there's no one right next to you to talk to. And obviously try not to raise your voice. I share all of that because, and as I said, I usually do this in a great big gathering, and it's fun because we can line people up when we ask the questions between 1 and 10, and we get people telling their own stories. But I want you to, kind of my call to action for you is to make a personal commitment to have one conversation, say this week, about climate change. And then once you practice, it'll feel easier. So again, I thought it would be useful to frame this up a bit because so much of our discussion about climate change is super technical. I am not a climate scientist. I am a social scientist. I was a government and sociology major and went to school for urban policy. So, you know, my academic background is not as a climate scientist. I get to play one on TV because I live my daily life now really thinking about how we as a state can act. But I just want to emphasize once more that our voices do matter and we can each make an impact on the people around us. So as you heard, I currently serve on Governor Mills's Climate Council. We're a group of about 40 stakeholders. We're serving for 2 more years and then see what happens after that. And then there were hundreds of others, Mainers, who were in what we called working groups by subject matter. And some of you may have been on some of those working groups. I know many of our board members and our staff were on a variety of working groups. So imagine we began our work at the behest of the legislature in January 2019. We were crowded, like completely arm to arm crowded in a room in Hollowell in a bed and breakfast that has parties. So we were there, Governor Mills is there, you know, everyone's super excited. We're launching our work. And of course, we all know what happens just a couple months later. We have COVID come and we have to adjust. We said, are we going to keep going or do we stop because nobody knows how to meet? So in fact, it was almost the reality of COVID that made us more determined because we did, of course, see the great disparity both in our state and around the country of how COVID was hitting our communities, and climate change is very similar to that kind of disparity. And then, so towards the end, I'll talk about the legislative session that just ended last night. And I'll just, through that, be able to talk about some of what's being implemented in this plan. So the Climate Council, well, the governor, the legislature, and now the Climate Council set goals for the state in 2019. I'm not going to read them off, but you can read them. They are quite progressive. We're one of the more progressive states in terms of our climate goals. Washington State just had a pretty amazing success as well, but Maine is now in a really decent place. The legislature also said, in addition to reaching our carbon emission goals, we had to think about economic opportunity and prosperity, think about what many of us call climate adaptation or resilience, and then, as I discussed, advance equity. This one always surprises people. Maybe you, because you live in Harpswell or you know Harpswell, you know how much we drive in Maine. Big state, you have far to go to get anywhere. And so the majority of our emissions come from transportation, and the bulk of the rest are the two, residential and commercial. So we get many of the targets that strategies we deployed, we're trying to get at reducing those percentages of emissions. I am not going to go through all 8 climate action strategies. I can point online or give to Julia to send out the link to read the entire climate action plan if you'd like. But I wanted to show the breadth of the strategies that we tried to address in the plan, and it's it's been pretty comprehensive. If you want me to touch on any of them, I'm happy to go back a little bit later. But one thing that was super important for the Conservancy and our colleagues in the conservation world here in Maine was to make sure that conservation and nature played a role in the plan, kind of connected to what we know is already happening that nature can do. So as an example, we have 90% of Maine is in forest cover. And so we spent a ton of energy focusing on making sure there are opportunities and goals set to conserve forests. That includes working forest lands, so industrial lands, and also small woodlot owner lands. And then, of course, something that we take great pride in is preserving places where nature can take its course. So as I said, 90% of our state is in forest cover. However, we were able, the science and our the state agencies were able to estimate that about 10,000 acres of forest land is lost annually to development. And projections show that that will easily accelerate to about 15,000 acres a year within this decade. So we wanted to underscore, as I said, the importance of, forest, and some of this applies to farms as well. It's an area that I am less familiar with, but Maine Farmland Trust was a participant, and so they would be a great resource. But Maine's forests hold a vast amount of carbon. So in recent years, our forests have been sequestering an amount equal to about 60% of Maine's total emissions. So all those trees, the dead wood, the soils hold about 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon. That's as much carbon as could be saved if we didn't have it by taking 47 million cars off the road for 25 years. And they're obviously big numbers, hard to relate to. And so just to make a finer point, the carbon in 100 acres of average Maine forest is equal to the emissions of 6,500 vehicles driven for 1 year and the annual energy use for 3,500 homes. Be happy to share, again, more details on this video, anything, if anyone wants later on. So the Climate Council outlined a number of strategies that will encourage the way forests are managed and increasing the incentives for storage of carbon in the soils. Something that I know is super close to all of your heart is, as I said, adaptation or resilience. This is what we called kind of the super working groups, because resilience is thought about in a number of ways. There's human health resilience, there's ecological resilience. And so there was groups that really specialized in each of those issues, and then we brought them together. So what we are seeing now already in Maine is more severe storms. You well know coastal flooding, heat waves, tick-borne diseases, and other challenges. So we need to make sure that if we're building infrastructure, it accounts for the reality of climate change. And the more we can use nature, like those preserves you were talking about, Reed, are so important to buffering our coastal communities from the impact of flooding. So really a focus of the Healthy Communities strategy was investing in local governments, local organizations like yours to work together to begin to make plans and deploy them in ways that really work for the communities you might live in. One example that is near and dear to my heart, because it's taking place here in Bath, the Conservancy is working with the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, Saginaw County Emergency Management, the health community, to work together really for the first time to look at human vulnerability and ecological vulnerability as we begin to map out our comprehensive climate adaptation plan. I mentioned when you have to build something. The reason we, the Nature Conservancy, spend so much time thinking about the built environment is because it has significant impact on our natural environment. So you probably know a little bit about, I actually saw a culvert in one of Julia's pictures. How we build the infrastructure under roads makes a big difference. And so over the last 13 years, the Conservancy, with partners like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Maine Department of Transportation, Maine Audubon, municipalities, and private landowners, have been working to create a statewide database of every single road stream crossing in the state. If it's in private lands, we do not share that information with the public in any way, but we share it back to, say, the industrial forest owner. The reason this is really important is because it gives local officials and you in town meeting and all of us a way to make kind of cost benefit analysis of where you need to make upgrades so that you're both preventing flooding and road washouts during severe storm events. And we're able to align that with the ecological data and show where we'll get, as we would call, kind of the restoration bang for the buck. So we look at trout waters, salmon waters, alewives, et cetera, and overlay that where there's the biggest restrictions. So we all have to make decisions about where to spend money. This gives us a tool, and the Climate Council document really pointed to this as an opportunity for the state to have one tool that we can all use. As I mentioned, during the process, we had already identified equity as a major issue of importance to all of us, the governor and the legislature. And then, of course, the George Floyd murder occurred, and between that and the disparities in COVID, it was clear that we needed, as a community, to add another working group to our team. And so we now have a standing working group, that's the Equity Subcommittee. And they, working with UMaine, have gone through all of the recommendations and are beginning to put a lens of, who will this benefit and who else could it benefit, and many, many other questions. And I will just say one other thing, back to my pitch about Anya. She was kind of the youth voice on the Climate Council. She and many, many young people had a huge impact on our recommendations about public education offerings and starting a climate corps, which is also being proposed by the Biden administration, but Maine now has an opportunity to put this forward. I could talk a long time about transportation. Many of you could as well. Again, one of the big, I guess, I don't know if I would call it tensions, but I would call it a place where we had to do two things at once. Rural Maine we need to figure out ways to help people in rural Maine move in vehicles that are mostly electrified, and we need to have the infrastructure for people to drive long ways with electrified vehicles. And Maine is sorely underfunding public transportation and things like biking and walking transportation. Even compared to Vermont, we spend much less on our public transportation infrastructure. We've done a lot of research with our conservancies in New Hampshire and Vermont about how do we accelerate the transition, as I was mentioning, to electric vehicles. Of course, electricity needs infrastructure and it needs to be renewable. So Maine is on track to get to 80% of its energy from renewable resources by 2030. As I said, it's one of the most ambitious standards in the country. We are focused on, so the Conservancy globally is very focused on making sure renewable energy is deployed quickly. And this is where the intersection of our mission really comes into play, and what we spend a lot of time focusing on is how does new clean energy development, how do we make sure it's sited to minimize the impacts on the very ecology that we're trying to protect. So planning for where solar should be sited, I can talk a little bit about offshore wind, et cetera, is really the question we are going to have to figure out very quickly, not just in Maine, but across New England together. So I wanted to end with this exciting news. So as I mentioned, the legislature ended yesterday, late last night, I think. And when we wrapped up the Climate Council and put the proposal back to the legislature, it was, as I said, December 2020. We, at that time, really didn't know still what the state, but we had good indications that the state budget hadn't taken as much as a hit as we had, I suppose, the governor's office had anticipated. So that was good news, but we didn't really anticipate the opportunity for significant federal funding. So last night, the legislature did approve most of the governor's recommendations that are listed here. Again, happy to talk about some of them that I'm more familiar with. Two things that aren't on here that got added yesterday is an additional $50 million for state parks, for infrastructure, facilities, et cetera, improving our state parks. And my favorite thing is also there's additional $3 million for these culverts, road stream crossings that we talked about, so that we basically match private philanthropy with these public dollars so that municipalities can create these this road infrastructure that's much more ecologically friendly and flood resilient. And here, Reed, and all of you out there, is my last call to action. The other great news was that the Land for Maine's Future was funded at $40 million. Yay! And that is to be spent, that's $40 million allocated over this next 4 years. It could be $10 million a year, or the board may decide to speed it up. But what's different than most years is that this money doesn't need to go out to all of us to vote on it, because it is coming from the federal funds, which then they become state funds, and then they can match federal funds through other grants. So my urging to you all is to keep up the great work, because it's going to be really important that we put forward to the Land for Maine Futures Board, as I said, locally relevant projects and those big forest projects that I was discussing earlier. So Julia, that's it. Thank you all very much. And I'm going to stop sharing for now. And I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was great. So I'm just going to encourage anyone who has questions to type them into the chat. All right, Rhiannon, we have one. So Lynn writes, one thing that worries me is the push for electric vehicles and electric heating. I worry that there will not be enough clean energy to meet the demand, and use of nuclear power will grow, which is a huge different kind of environmental problem. How is the council thinking about making sure we don't move too fast on to EVs before we have clean energy supply in place?
Awesome question. And of course, not a simple answer. So one thing that's happening right now is what's being called the transportation roadmap, which is really looking at the end point of that question, which is where do we need the electric charging stations, et cetera, so that there are no kind of dead spaces, and we don't have people worried about driving too far and losing access to their vehicle. Maine, remember, this gets into that technical thing. Maine is in a grid system, electric grid system with all of New England. And so right now, Maine does produce a significant amount of clean or renewable energy. Before the Climate Council bill was passed, there was a renewable portfolio set for the state of Maine, and it really identified what type of energy would count towards renewable credits for renewable credits. And that is why, Lynn, you're seeing this kind of sudden surge of solar being cited. And that gets back to what I talked about, which is we, along with some of our colleagues at Maine Audubon and at the state and other places, are using kind of our ecological science to really identify where solar in particular really shouldn't go, so that we're keeping our forests connected from the Adirondacks up to Canada. It's super important for climate resilience. And so it's a great question. The state is taking it seriously. There's an Office of Energy that the governor put in, well, reinvested in, and that would be the place I would go to see kind of the latest and greatest, but it is right in front of our concerns and something that we're investing our science team in examining.
Great. And there's a similar question from Ed, who asks, has there been discussion or will there be investment in energy storage to smooth out the production of wind and solar power?
Great question. It's absolutely, that is kind of the big question. I don't have a simple answer. I know that we are working with a number of entities to think about how to do it well. I know the state, mostly energy producers, solar producers, are thinking about it. And so, yes, we need to figure out battery storage. And is Maine going to do it alone? No. Lynn, I realize I never answered your nuclear question, so we can touch on that if you want still, but maybe take a few other questions and go back to that.
Okay. There's a specific question about the money for state parks and what that money is going to be for.
Yeah. So my understanding, and again, this came in last night, 50. So when we were trying to put together the Land for Maine Future Bond initially, we were really looking at it as a combination of upgrades to park infrastructure. As I said, there's been a huge uptick of use of our state parks and our conservation lands. And so, frankly, they've been underinvested in. And so we're seeing, basically pit toilets that have the potential of polluting, things like that. I'm sure the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and the specific Department of Bureau of Parks and Lands has a outline for where that money would go, but I haven't seen it yet myself.
Okay, thanks. And then there's another good question from Josie, who asks, does the climate plan address energy conservation? It seems that it is overlooked in many discussions about climate.
Hi, Josie. Great question. Actually, years ago, I've been at the Conservancy for 18 years, and one of the things we always used to really emphasize is exactly what Josie said, which is the most efficient thing we can do is to invest in reducing the use of energy at all. So that's conservation of a different type. That's why I was hesitating. So energy conservation means, of course, insulation, more efficient fuel sources. And one of the important things that Maine and our neighbors have done over the last 10 years is that we are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a regional cap on emissions and trade. And the money that the state of Maine gets primarily goes to Efficiency Maine. And they allocate that money out to industrial users like manufacturing to do upgrades. And in great part, there's a lot of money for individual homeowners and like Maine Housing Authority to invest in upgrading our buildings. As you may remember that first chart, after transportation was buildings. And so we, one of Maine's biggest challenges is basically our old housing infrastructure. And this is where, it gets kind of scary. I mean, what we saw in British Columbia is very equivalent to what we would see here in Maine if there was a huge spike in temperature. Most homes in Maine don't have air conditioning. That gets back to electrification and the need to figure that out. But because of that, and because our population is older and more remote from each other, there's one of the number one risks for the state of Maine is heat death from people living in their buildings and their homes and being isolated and not getting help. So that's the depressing part of my conversation. But Josie is absolutely right. There is additional investment in Efficiency Maine. And one of the things the Nature Conservancy has been doing is we've been helping, in particular, municipalities. First, we invested in rooftop solar for municipal buildings. We worked with CEI right here in Brunswick and the state of Maine. And then more recently, we've been helping municipalities switch over to LED lights. Now, that seems like, in the scheme of how urgent our action needs to be, kind of minor. But why it's really important goes back to that social behavior research I was referencing. When towns act on climate change, people see that they are A, saving tax dollars, and B, well, if the town can do it, it's not so scary. So in fact, towns, municipal governments really become where we want to kind of push to be a leader. So, we have a grant program, as I said, through Efficiency Maine, but we fund the program for energy efficient lighting with municipalities.
Great. You kind of answered some of the other questions, but I will ask Wendy's question, which is a follow-up question about what's known about the right balance between the need for solar farms and maintaining the forest cover. And you talked a little bit about rooftop solar, but how much emphasis is it on rooftops versus solar farms?
So, super important question. And this is where I turn to my colleague, Mark Berry, who is our forest strategy director and thinks forest carbon pretty much every waking moment of the day. Where forests are in place right now, so mostly northern Maine, but of course we know we have important forests down here in southern Maine. It is really critical to keep, in particular, those soils undisturbed. So if you need to clear a forest to put in solar, it's going to be, you'd really have to weigh the cost benefit on the carbon equation. As you probably all know, there is some really great examples of solar on farms. It's land that's already open. It allows farmers to stay in farmland because it gives them another source of revenue. And the soils, you're able to keep those soils relatively undisturbed. So that is a really important question, is making sure we all keep front of mind that in our enthusiasm, and I, again, think about renewables a lot, our enthusiasm to get renewables on the ground, we could be, in Maine in particular, kind of paying Peter to whatever that expression is. Rooftop solar, it always feels like that should be the magic solution. Old rooftop or old parking lots are a good option. Frankly, it's really hard for solar developers, and we need the solar developers moving fast. And that's it's a tension. We in Maine, over at our offices at Fort Andros, and when we renovated our space, we worked with Waterfront Maine for them to install the solar, because we wouldn't get the tax credits, but we reminded them that they would. And it was a great example. And we do hope, Maine Audubon's done that. A number of other nonprofits have invested in solar on their properties. And that's, again, schools are another great place to do that. Christine, there you go. Project for you.
Great. We've got three big topics. I'll let you choose what you want to talk about first. One is dams and fish passage and the potential conflict between opening up this fish passage and hydropower. The second is recycling and the recent legislation around that. And the third is offshore wind. So three big things that you could talk about. Which would you like to address?
All right, well, let me say, I'm sorry, Anne, I'm not, the recycling bill, obviously, I believe it's the first in the nation. I know that's about all I know. I know as much as you do from the newspaper. It's not a bill we worked on. It's not our area of expertise. So I'm going to defer that one and we can try to find you a source on that. So how many hours do you want me to talk about dams and fish passage? It literally is my favorite subject. Let me just say with offshore wind, it is our position that from our research, we can't meet our climate goals without offshore wind. And just like everything, I think all of us hold dearly is stakeholder processes that are legitimate and that allow other resource users to have influence and thinking added into the system. So I think we feel like the compromise that the governor met with this pilot off of Monhegan, most likely, and not having it close in at shore really makes sense for our lobstering communities. But I will say we really do need to get offshore wind out there. I spent some time in Denmark a few years ago, and seeing it there, it just actually reinforced my sense that it's really doable for coastal communities. It's a big pill to swallow, but so is drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's what we're always balancing, is like, we want the energy, but then we have to figure out how we're going to produce it. And I would say, on balance, let's produce it from other renewables. So dams and fish. I spent most of my career at TNC working on the Penobscot River restoration, which removed 3 dams and bypassed a 4th on the Penobscot River, opening up the main stem of the dam. The hydro company was able to produce, through our agreement, produce energy on other dams that were less impactful ecologically. As a result, we're seeing millions upon millions of fish return, and we actually have a net gain in energy produced since 2009, when we first, our partners actually first penned the agreement. So dams are super complicated in that some of them are really big. They are producing a ton of energy, and they're usually higher up on a river, like on the course of a river. And so really, if they stay in place, the ecological damage is, on the scheme of things, relatively less. Dams, one of your guests and I were talking about this just last night. Dams on lower rivers, the lower section of rivers like the Kennebec, like in Ellsworth, you're seeing a lot of conversation about the dams that are low in the river. Those have a tremendous ecological impact on fish, and they're producing really tight, relatively little amounts of energy that could easily be replaced with additional solar. Battery storage would really help as well. So the Conservancy globally, actually because of the work of the Penobscot River, thinks a lot and does a ton of ecological science planning around where should dams go and where they really shouldn't be. Most places in the world, especially in Africa and China, they're being built right now. And so figuring out where they can be built and where they shouldn't be built, South America as well. In the US, it's much more of a question of what should come out and what should stay. I would say for us in Maine, that will be one of the big questions in the infrastructure bill, how you, should the federal government be investing in dams that really are low producers of energy, but have high ecological damage? So again, that's one of my favorite subjects. So we could do another talk on that, Julia.
Yeah, and actually one of our webinars that's recorded on our website is John Banks talking about the Penobscot River restoration. So if you guys are, if you're all interested in that, we have something that you could watch. Does anyone else have any questions or anything that they'd like to talk about with Kate while we're here?
Yes,
All
I
right,
would.
go ahead.
I'd like to express my concerns that on the offshore wind issue, that we seem to be reinventing a wheel, because my last opportunity about 10 years ago to do with Statoil, to do offshore wind, went astray because of a certain person. But I think we're going at it far too slowly, and we're not really understanding what the capabilities are versus the onshore solar panels, which obviously take up land that can be used for other purposes. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. And thank you very much for a very, very informative topic and presentation.
Thanks so much. I amend as we say in Zoom land, +1. You're absolutely right. And that's the important thing is, one of the things I really enjoy about working with the Conservancy is we work with colleagues around the world, but here in New England, we develop strategies together. And so, there's some really great examples of offshore wind off of Block Island. The community participated in siting that. And you're absolutely right. We really need to figure out ways to get that wind out there. And you all know probably as well as I do, there's a ton of controversy around that, and we're going to have to find a path forward because, as I said, in New England, we won't reach our emissions reduction goals without it.
How do I do this? What's the matter with me? I want to ask a question, and I'm.
Go ahead, Ellen.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
You may have covered this before because I had to come a little bit late. Do you take a position on the CMP corridor?
Oh, Ellen, we had to end there, huh?
Well,
yeah, so let me try to think of a short answer, because this is the funny thing about everything's gray area in our work. Everything's like figuring out the balance. So we are not formally opposed to the New England Connect corridor. The Nature Conservancy's Massachusetts office worked on the legislation that got the renewable portfolio standard passed. I have personal, I wish the state of Massachusetts had chosen many of the other options that were proposed to them, but they haven't. So where the Nature Conservancy in Maine have invested our time is really analyzing the question and presenting. We were an intervener in the case before the Department of Environmental Protection. And long story short, our focus has been making sure there's contiguous forest and what we call mitigation. Reed and I were talking about in lieu fee wetlands mitigation. This is forest mitigation. So finding opportunities for significant conservation in the region is really important, and an investment on having CMP invest significantly on fish passage, as we were discussing. I will say, and this won't, make everyone happy, but I will say that the package that the Department of Environmental Protection put out in terms of mitigation, now I can't speak nationally totally, but it is one of the most, it was a huge step. Usually, we have federal laws that tell you how to mitigate for wetland impact. This is really the first time we've seen this kind of mitigation requirements coming for forest protection and water protection. That all of us are going to have to weigh whether that's good enough. And it's super, super complicated. And Ellen, it'll probably be on the ballot. There's lots of time to go, I suspect, before this all gets resolved, though construction has begun on the corridor.
Right, I think we could probably take one more question if anyone has anything that they would like to ask. So you can either type it into the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask in person.
Don't be shy. Well, one thing, Julia, I began our talk about talking to your friends about climate change. And I think for many of us, that feels like, really, the world's burning. Is that enough? No, it's not enough, but it is a really important start. And then taking those voices, communities really, I used to work for Congress. It really does, and that's where I think Tony and I met. It really does make a difference when local communities go in and meet with our federal delegation or your local legislators. It again feels like banging your head against the wall sometimes, but it really, really, from my experience, local voices, land trusts, municipalities, talking to your members of Congress do have impact. So I try to end on a super hopeful note. I'm not sure I landed there, Julia and Reed, but what I do want to end by saying, it is very clear from the climate plan that conservation, so we talked about energy conservation, but also the conservation that you all and the land trust community is doing around Maine is absolutely critical. And it really will keep us in a place that is more resilient ecologically as climate changes, and keeps the soil capturing carbon for years into the future. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. Well, I really, really appreciate you coming and talking to us, Kate. I really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their evening to join us.
Thank you all.
Next year, we'll see each other in person again, right? I hope.
Thanks so much, everyone.
I'm just going to say good night, everyone.
Good night.